each of these formula with the context in which it is being made. So the law of transformation of quantity into quality, and a classic physical example is, you know, the freezing point, 0 degrees centigrade, 100 degrees centigrade, the boiling point of water. So that's a very good physical analogy of how quantity turns into quality. It's ice, and then all of a sudden it becomes liquid, and then all of a sudden it becomes gas, qualitative changes. And now in Hegel, the transformation of quantity into quality is in the context of a first major transition which he makes in his schema, and that's called the doctrine of being. Okay, and I'll come to that in the next part. But I want you to remember this. Quantity into quality is connected for Hegel with what he calls the doctrine of being. Okay, and again, the next connection is very important. The law of the interpenetration of opposites, which is really about the unity of opposites in contradiction. So one could also say the second point is about contradiction. Okay. Now, again, in Hegel, a contradiction arises in the context of what he calls the doctrine of essence. So in the essence of a category, there will be contradictions in Hegel. Okay, right. And then the third reductive law, the negation of the negation. Now, Engels again identifies that in the context of Hegel's work as a fundamental law for the construction of the whole system. That's true, but it's only part of the truth. In fact, Hegel uses negation of the negation in a third transition. So he's got a tri-structure, and his third transition is a category which he calls Begriff in German, which is translated differently. We'll call it concept, right? So the negation of the negation occurs when essence turns into concept. Okay, and I'll explain, this will all become a bit clearer, but what I'm trying to establish here is that these laws aren't like recipes that you can apply willy-nilly to different content. That they need to be understood in the context of the system of ideas from which they emerged. Engels, in this continuation of his introduction to dialectics, what he's saying here is Hegel had an idealist understanding of dialectics, and we have a materialist one. Okay. He's basically saying that here, that apparently in Hegel, the laws of dialectics emerge from thought, okay? But that thought, which Hegel says they emerge from, is itself only the product of a definite stage of evolution of human thought. So he's turning Hegel on himself in that sense, right? He's trying to position or root Hegel's ideas at a particular point in history, right? And once you turn it around, he says, Engels says, then everything becomes simple. And we'll see how simple we can make it, right? The dialectical laws that look so mysterious in idealist philosophy, that's Hegel, right? Only one at once becomes simple and clear as noonday. Okay, well, we'll do our best on that. I'm not sure how clear we can make it. We'll do our best. Okay, now, Hegel's logic. This is a Science of Logic, and he also wrote about it in another publication called Encyclopedia. It's important to recognize with Lenin that there was something progressive, not in Hegel's political ideas, but that there was a progressive aspect to his system of thought, right? And what it is that for Hegel, logic includes practice. It's not just about speech, but the categories of thought are extended into practice. So in other words, they include what people do as well as what they say, okay? Now, this was a break with the philosophical canon of his time, and he expanded the realm of logic to include content, connectivity, and change. Okay. Now, the best commentary in my reading is by Ilyenkov. Ilyenkov is very much got a Leninist position on Hegel, which is that he was an intelligent idealist. So there is something to take from him as well as to critique. Okay. And what Ilyenkov is emphasizing about Hegel is this, some appreciation of within bourgeois thought, if you like, how he took bourgeois thought to its limit. Okay, and the limit is that the content matters to the categories of logic. So Hegel was a professional logician, if you like, so he only recognized it in his terms, but there was a recognition. Okay. Now, Hegel's philosophy is generally seen to be objective idealism. What is meant by that is objective. It's not just an individual thinking, it's a sort of like a movement of a culture, if you like, of the totality of human thought at any given time. Idealism, because of course everything is about thought and its expression in reality. It's that way around with Hegel. Hegel's thought moves from, as I've already mentioned, through three doctrines. The first one is the simplest appearance of something as it immediately surfaces, if you like. The simplicity of being, does it exist, doesn't exist, how does its existence become formed? It's a bit amoeba-like, emerging from the swamp being. And you can see this as both a theory of knowledge and a theory of existence in a way. He mixes the two up. So you could also think of it as, how do we first know about something? Well, we get a first impression, we're just trying to find out about it. And for example, this is how Mao sees Hegel's dialectics. He explains it in this way, okay? The other thing about this movement from being to essence to concept or notion, that these three parts, is it's got a sort of a strong spatial metaphor. So it's a movement from the outer being to the inner essence, and then a combination of the two. Okay, it's very quiet. Now you can also see within essence, finally, before I move away from this one, there are three modes of essence. First is it a reflection from being into essence, how you move from one to the other. The second is Hegel actually includes in essence appearance, which is kind of like counterintuitive, right? But what he's saying is, what I include in essence is how something appears is also essential to it. Okay, so there's kind of like a mirror image between what's inside and what's outside, and there must be some connection between the two. And that connection is what he deals with in what he calls actuality. So using this sort of spatial metaphor, you have inside, outside, and how does one become the other? Okay. And just to complete the cycle, that last one is the inside and the outside. How does one become another essence? And then the movement from subject to object, an idea, is more about self-consciousness of this thing, which is being inside, outside, and reflected. So it's the emergence of consciousness, which is really the third element of his philosophy. Okay, now, in order to understand what Marx overthrows in Hegel, let's just take this one step further before we move off Hegel, right? For Hegel, contradiction is something which emerges in thought and is resolved within thought. Okay, this is really important. Okay, so in the definition of essence, in the process of defining essence, contradictions arise. Something is and not is. Something is itself and there's also a relation with the other. This is a kind of sense of difference becoming contradiction that Hegel deals with. Okay. He also has another concept which Marx uses a lot, which is sublation, right? And the sublation is the movement from essence into concept, right? Sublation is to do with a contradiction moving on to a different plane. Now, this is the so-called negation of negation idea, sort of pop presentations of Hegel give this the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? So in the green area, the contradiction is resolved, okay? So a contradiction emerges in thought, it is resolved in thought as a sort of an overarching concept which knows the good and bad in things and can include them both, okay? So harmony is restored. After contradiction breaks out, harmony is restored, including the good and bad in itself. Okay, there's one other point to make here, which is this outer ellipse I've put in, because there's a discussion. I mean, I'm not a Hegel scholar, I have to tell you, right? This is pretty low-level stuff if you're a professional philosopher, I guess, right? But Hegel begins with the idea of being that doesn't have any presuppositions. There's no assumptions about the reality. It's just like emerging from the mists and begins to take shape. But when you come to the end of his cycle, you realize that actually there were assumptions. So it wasn't without presupposition in the language. And these assumptions are to do with how something begins to know of itself. And this is the sort of the ellipse line I'm putting in, right? Once you get the idea is a complete consciousness, not only of itself, but of its surroundings, how it got to where it is. In other words, an all-knowing, all-seeing power, okay? The other last thing about this, there's a lot of literature which I'm not, I want to leave to one side because of time, right? But I do find one commentary very helpful, which is what Hegel is doing in philosophy is a parallel with what classical political economy was doing, right? And what he's actually giving us is capital's uncritical reflection of itself. So the all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing thing that emerges, that dominates all reality, is actually a capital. I mean, Hegel says it's God, but it's capital as God, if you like, okay? And Hegel sees this final harmonizing idea at the end, the absolute idea, as something which is both, it's self-moving, it has its own power of control and movement over itself. And this is without doubt idealization of capital at the height of its sort of ascendance to power. Right, so that's kind of like, now I want to, if you like, not so much deconstruct as explain the influence then of Hegel on Marx, because this was really where I want to get to, right? So we're now on like a second loop of explanation. So Engels already told us that, materialists think of contradiction in a different way. And I just want to expand on that, right? And how contradiction is used in Marx's Capital, right? So the foundational point is that contradiction exists in reality. It's, if you like, an ontological point about what the reality is. And for Marx as a materialist, so contradictions exist in reality and they're reflected and to a greater or lesser extent successfully reconstructed in thought, okay? So the contradiction exists independent of thought, and the contradiction is antagonistic. It cannot be resolved in thought alone. It can only be resolved in reality, okay? You can say you resolved it in thought, but that, if you like, is an idealized resolution. It's not a real resolution. Okay, and the reality, of course, that Marx is looking at is a contradiction between two subjects, the exploiter and the exploited. Okay, so a fundamental point about Marx's concept of contradiction is that it's relational. He's got a sense of contradiction being a contradictory relation, which is at the essence of the capitalist mode of production. And that contradictory relation is the antagonism between labor and capital. Now, he does use sublation because what he shows is how that contradiction